بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره العظيم. ربي اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Alhamdulillah, we are here together for the third lesson in the work Foundations of Certitude. The first class covered an introduction to the science of Aqidah. We talked about the importance of studying Aqidah properly. We also talked about the al-mabadi al-ashara, the 10 foundational matters that one should know before engaging in any science, any area of study. And in our second session, we went into the beginning of the book itself. We talked about the meaning of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We talked about the opening dua, as-salatu ala nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And we mentioned that generally when people write books on Islamic subjects, they open with what they call a dibaj, which is a ornamented opening. You'll find in Arabic the opening statement in any book will be very ornamented and eloquent. So in today's class, we're going to go to line number 6. Line number 6 is where the actual content of Aqidah begins in this text, Foundations of Certitude. And it doesn't begin by talking about the content of Aqidah. Rather, it talks about two very important things. Number one, what is the very first obligation upon every morally responsible person? And number two, it talks about how to know what we know. So today we're going to talk about these two issues, and in the next class and probably the class after that, we're going to be looking at how do we know anything? How do we know what we know? So we begin with line 6, which says, pondering deeply and knowing the truth is your first duty at onset of youth. Here it mentions two things: pondering deeply and knowing the truth. This is the act of reflection, the act of contemplation, of pondering. In Arabic we call this nadar. And knowing the truth, and this is having ma'rifah, having knowledge. This is the very first duty when a person has reached the age of moral responsibility. When a person, male or female, reaches the age of moral responsibility, which means that they have reached the age of puberty, and they are sane, they're not mentally incapacitated, and they have heard the message of Islam, that person is considered mukallaf. So this is a term we need to understand. The term mukallaf. The mukallaf is the person who is subject to moral accountability. In Arabic, the word mukallaf is an object noun, meaning the one who is given moral responsibility. They are tasked with moral responsibility and they are held accountable. And the Sharia as a whole can only pertain to people who are mukallaf, who are legally responsible. When we look at the different types of rulings, for instance, we're going to look at three in the coming weeks. One of them is called al-hukm shar'i, the legal ruling. We know the legal rulings as five. Those things that are haram, those things that are wajib, obligatory, those things that are recommended, those things that are disliked, and fifthly, those things that are legally neutral, mubah. These are the five categories of legal rulings. Nothing in our life escapes one of these five rulings. But the hukm shar'i, the legal ruling as a category, is defined as khitabullah al-muta'allaq bi af'al al-mukallafin. It is the address of Allah, the divine, concerning the actions of those who are mukallafin, morally responsible. This means that the Sharia, the sacred law of Islam, only applies to people who have reached the age of moral responsibility. So, as it concerns commanding the good and forbidding the evil, telling people that they should do X, Y, and Z and should stop doing X, Y, Z, it's not a condition that they have to be morally accountable, because you can tell a child who's 4 years old to stop doing something. That's not lawful. It doesn't mean they're accountable, right? But accountability in those matters is for those who have reached taklif. They have certain conditions met to where they are held morally responsible. So who is the mukallaf? Well, the mukallaf is the person who has, number one, reached the age of puberty. And the age of puberty is indeterminate. It could be earlier or later, depending on the region, the climate, one's ancestors. Some people attain puberty earlier or later than others. But that marks the transition from childhood to moral responsibility. So if a person reaches puberty through the recognizable signs of puberty, they are morally accountable. And those signs are, the clearest signs are, of course, menstruation or a wet dream, and in the absence of that, the appearance of pubic hair. And in the absence of both of those, or any of those, then it is either reaching the age of 15 or 18. There's different opinions in the schools of law. I believe in the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, if there are no signs of puberty manifest, then the person is considered morally accountable at 15. That's the cutoff age. And in the school of Imam Malik, if there are no signs of puberty, then the person is considered morally accountable when they reach the age of 18. Right? So, that's the first condition for the mukallaf, the legally responsible person. They have to reach puberty. Secondly, they have to be sane. If they are not sane, if they're majnoon, if they have something inhibiting their mental state where they are not sane, then they're not mukallaf, because they cannot be addressed with the commands and the prohibitions, because those things require aql, they require sound intellect. And the third condition is that that person must have heard the message of Islam. Like, a person is not morally responsible for praying 5 prayers if they live in the middle of the Amazon rainforest in a hut by themselves and have never heard the message of Islam. Right? So, if a person has reached the age of puberty and they are sane and they've heard the message of Islam, they are mukallaf, and that person is morally legally accountable in this life and in the next. When that person is mukallaf, it means they can earn good deeds, they can also earn sins, and they are liable to punishment in the hereafter for their wrong actions, and they are also liable to punishment for their crimes in this life. So this concept of taklif, and when it occurs, is mentioned in the line where it says, pondering deeply and knowing the truth is your first duty at onset of youth. So the onset of youth is the term we're using for taklif, being morally accountable. So this line is saying that when you reach the age of moral accountability, the very first obligation, according to the theologians, the scholars of Aqidah, it's not for you to go make wudu and pray. It's not technically the first obligation on you. The first obligation is to have ma'rifah, to have knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, to know the truth. So sometimes the ulama of theology say the first obligation is to know. And sometimes they say it's to ponder. And both of these are here in the line. Pondering deeply and knowing the truth. And the reason why some said pondering is the first obligation and others said knowing is because the first party said you don't reach that ma'rifah, that knowledge of Allah Ta'ala, except through reflecting, except through pondering. So really that would be the first obligation, because through pondering, through reflection, you come to knowledge. You come to arrive at knowledge about your Lord and His attributes. Therefore, nadar will be the first obligation, this pondering. So the legal duty to ponder and know the truth is the first obligation. And this first obligation helps us avoid something called taqleed. Taqleed. Now, with a show of hands, how many of you have heard of the word taqleed? Most of you. Taqleed is a term used in the Sharia, and it has two general meanings. Or we can say it has two ways in which it's used. And we have to understand this, because without this understanding, it can lead to confusion. Let's go to the standard, most commonly recognized understanding of the term taqleed. The common understanding of the term taqleed is that it means to follow the statement of someone else without knowing his or her proofs. To follow the statement of someone else without knowing his or her proofs. In the domain of Islamic law, of fiqh, taqleed is to follow the position of a qualified scholar of Islamic law who is capable of extracting legal judgments from the primary text of the Quran and the Sunnah. That person will be called a mujtahid, the one who is capable of extracting those rulings from the Quran and the Sunnah directly. That person has met so many incredibly difficult conditions, they're called a mujtahid. If a person has not reached that degree of knowledge, if they're not a mujtahid, then their obligation is to follow qualified scholarship. Allah Ta'ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. This means that Allah says, ask the people of dhikr, the people of knowledge, if you do not know. Our obligation as Muslim laymen and laywomen is to seek out a qualified scholar to help answer our legal questions. We are not obliged to go directly to the Quran and the Sunnah and extract detailed legal rulings as if we are recreating the wheel. We're doing the effort of 1,400 years of scholarship from scratch on our own, with our own very limited resources. It's not our obligation. Our obligation is to ask qualified scholars who are capable of giving those rulings. Yes?
How would one know qualified scholars?
That's a really good question, and it's really more suited for a separate class. And we're actually, before the coronavirus, we were going to do a workshop, a weekend workshop, just on that question and issues of fatwa, the etiquettes of fatwa, seeking fatwa, the qualities of muftis, and all of this stuff. It's a really good question. Generally, it would be the one who was recognized by other reputable scholars and whose rulings inspire you with confidence. But we're talking about taqleed in matters of law, in matters of fiqh. Because the vast bulk of legal rulings in fiqh are matters that require specialization. And there are intricacies and details far beyond the grasp of the average person. The average person would require a substantial amount of legal training to be able to approach those discussions and arrive at their own conclusion. So what this means is, it's not the obligation upon every one of us to become mujtahids. Because if that was an obligation, then life as we know it would desist. Life as we know it would end. Because the baker, the butcher, the electrician, the engineer, the doctor, and the lawyer would not be able to practice their trades, because they would take so much effort for them to reach those qualifications. So the world would cease to function effectively. Therefore, it's not an obligation for us to know the inside, in and out details of matters of law. It's sufficient to gain a basic understanding of what is obligatory, or fard ayn, to ask qualified scholars, and we don't have to know the intricate arguments for these things. So that taqleed, that following of qualified scholarship, it is technically following the statement of someone else without knowing their proofs. Because even if they tell you a proof, you won't necessarily know the intricacies of how that is a proof in the first place. This form of taqleed is absolutely fine. In fact, it is a requirement for a person who has not reached the area of the degree of ijtihad, of being able to extract the law directly from the primary text. That taqleed in law, is deferring to experts, and this is permissible. Rather, it is an obligation for the non-mujtahid, right? But that is not the taqleed we're talking about today. This is why it's important to describe taqleed in law and what it means versus taqleed in matters of belief. If someone says, what happens if you are traveling to Medina and you arrive, you go into the masjid and you find that the imam has already prayed Isha? Do you A, pray the Isha prayer as 4 rak'ah, or do you pray it as 2, seeing as you just arrived and you are a traveler? It's not a difficult question, but it does involve some research. It does involve some level of study. Someone would need to learn that. And one would defer to qualified scholarship. They could go and ask a mufti, what do I do in this situation? Problem solved. But the same can't be said with regard to belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because taqleed in matters of belief is a lot more dangerous. And taqleed in matters of belief is nowhere like taqleed in matters of law, because it is not that complex. And you have to know for yourself and not just defer to what someone else says. Right? So this brings us to a very important conversation. And it is about taqleed in matters of belief, where a person parrots the beliefs they receive from their parents or society without direct knowing through searching and seeking and understanding. This is called mas'alat al-muqallid, the issue of the muqallid. So taqleed in the matters of belief is quite different from taqleed in matters of law. Because taqleed in matters of belief is to place a person on the level of evidence in something that you have to know for yourself. It is the condition of a person who says, I don't have to know this issue for myself, I'm just going to follow so and so regarding this matter. You see, in law, that's fine. You could say, I don't know the ins and outs of how to divide my property in case I die. How do we deal with estate division for our uncle who died? Who gets what and how much? And these details require some study. I don't have the time or the ability to arrive at an understanding of these matters, so I'm going to defer to an expert in that matter. That's absolutely fine. But with regards to belief in Allah, one cannot say, I don't have to know myself, I'm just going to follow what so-and-so tells me. This taqleed in matters of belief is very problematic and is nowhere comparable to taqleed in matters of law, where it's an obligation for the one who doesn't know. So the question becomes, if a person says, I don't have to know this for myself about Allah, I'm going to follow that person so-and-so and what they say regarding Allah Ta'ala. So the question then becomes, why that person? Why follow that person and what they say? If someone says this, they usually cite the fact that it's from their family or society or some dogmatic belief, and it's no different from the Jahili idol worshippers in the pre-Islamic period, who, when confronted with the fallacy of idol worship, said, we follow what our forefathers have left us. They don't have direct knowledge of any of this. They're only deferring to their ancestors. So the question is, why defer to them? Why not defer to someone else? It's a very arbitrary issue. Why select following this person or that person and not someone else? So taqleed in matters of belief is problematic. It's arbitrary, because if you accept taqleed in matters of belief for yourself, why don't you accept it from others? A person can say, I don't know this for myself, I'm just following what my parents gave me. And they are a Christian, or they are a Jew, or they are a Hindu, or they are a Baha'i, or they are a Unitarian, or they're even a Satanist. They can just say, I am following so-and-so in this matter. So if taqleed in matters of belief is acceptable for us, why isn't it acceptable for others? It's very arbitrary. We demand others to arrive at knowledge about Allah Ta'ala, but we accept it for ourselves to simply parrot what our parents gave us without seeking to know it properly. So this is one of the negative qualities of taqleed. It's circular, it's arbitrary, and one of the unique things about taqleed in matters of belief is that it often accompanies bigotry. It often accompanies ta'assub, this strong conviction that is really bigoted in how it expresses itself. It often comes with heat and anger and forcefulness. If a person has certain knowledge that it's a sunny day, how do they know it's a sunny day? Well, they've gone outside and they've seen for themselves that the sun is out and it's a sunny day. When they're standing outside on a sunny day, they have conviction through direct knowledge. You're not going to find that person going around shouting at everyone saying that the sun is out. The person who's going around shouting, the sun is out, the sun is out, this is indicative of some projection of doubt. It's something going on inside of them. They feel the need to shout at other people about this so-called conviction of theirs, because in reality it's lacking in them. If a person has certainty, it brings with it a certain coolness, a certain tranquility and confidence that is not found in the one who is only following what was given to them without direct knowledge. So you see the people who are the most bigoted, who are usually the loudest in cramming their beliefs down others' throats, are usually the people who are lacking in real conviction. It's like they have to shout it to convince themselves that what they believe is true. But if you have belief that the sun is out because you've seen it for yourself, you don't have to argue with someone that the sun is out. You don't have to get defensive and angry if they say it's not. You could say, listen, here's how you can discover for yourself that the sun is out. Open your eyes. Look over there. But it's not a cause for getting angry and shouting and feeling so defensive. So with certainty comes a certain coolness, a certain tranquility. Not to say that you can't get into an informed discussion with someone, but with taqleed, usually there's a certain bigotry that comes with it. And the reason why this bigotry and heat and severity accompanies taqleed is because ultimately, following someone else in matters of belief without knowing it directly is a fallacious appeal to authority. It's appealing to the authority of someone who is not an authority. It's appealing to something as a proof that is not a proof. So, as Muslims, we have to escape taqleed in matters of belief while embracing taqleed in matters beyond our expertise in areas of law. It's really that simple. But like everything else in the Islamic sciences, when you begin learning them, you learn it in the simplified format, but as you go along, you realize there are some levels of detail to this. So the question that we put in the beginning is, what is the ruling on the muqallid? What is the ruling about the one who is following their forefathers only as their source and do not have direct knowledge themselves? What's the ruling on this? And when we look in the works of our ulama, we see a variety of opinions. And in those opinions, we find that over time, the settled upon view becomes one or two positions. One of the views among the ulama is that it's allowed for a person to make taqleed in matters of belief as long as they have conviction in it that it is truth, to such an extent that if the source from which they learned it had abandoned Islam, they would stay Muslim. This is a person who they hear about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and these details about faith, and they don't have direct knowledge themselves. They're just following what they receive from their parents. But they develop conviction. One opinion says that this is allowed, provided they would stay upon the faith and would not leave it, even if the source from which they received it was to leave it. If they left it because the source left it, it means they were following the source exclusively. But if the source left it and they stayed, it became a conviction in their heart. This is one opinion. So the matter is, does it become a conviction? And do they hold to that regardless of the circumstances? And this applies mostly in a village context, where a person doesn't have a lot of access to learning, but they have a yaqeen, something that they develop through receiving Islam from their parents and from their society. One opinion says that it is haram, it's unlawful to follow another in matters of belief if one has the ability to investigate, if one has the ability to contemplate, to arrive at knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if that person has the ability, it is haram for them to follow someone else. And conversely, it would be allowed for someone who does not have that ability. Some people don't have reasoning skills. For them, it's very complex. They may get a headache to think about these issues, but they arrive at an understanding without that kind of investigation. This opinion says they're okay. In the Islamic tradition, there's even an opinion voiced by Al-Imam As-Sanusi, a very, very strict, maybe even extreme position. He says that if a person has the ability to reflect and contemplate and arrive at knowledge on their own, and they choose to blindly follow without knowing evidence, he says that person is actually not even a Muslim to begin with. Most of the ulama didn't accept that position. But he argued it quite well, and later on he took a different position, a more lenient one, which became the majority position of scholars throughout history from his time onward, which is that if a person has beliefs that are congruent with the truth and they blindly followed, they are disobedient if they have the ability to know these things for themselves. But they're still Muslim as long as the beliefs are correct. And that's the standard view, right? And then you have even one opinion, the final opinion that I'll cite here, of some ulama, such as Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and Imam Muhammad al-Safarini, who say that unquestionably following the Quran and the Sunnah is not even called taqleed in the first place. So if you believe in Allah Ta'ala through reading the Quran and through hearing the words of the Prophet ﷺ, if you come to know of Allah's attributes through reading the Quran and through hearing the words of the Prophet ﷺ, that cannot be called taqleed, properly speaking. And therefore, the issue of taqleed, it's a mute question really, if a person is receiving their beliefs from revelation, from wahi, from the Quran and the Sunnah. However, there's a little bit of a problem here, because as Imam As-Sanusi and others said, the fact that the Quran and the Sunnah are legitimate sources of proof cannot be known except through reasoning, through nazar, outside of that circle. How do you know that the Quran and the Sunnah are authorities in matters of belief? You have to have an understanding of that before you can receive your belief from the Quran and the Sunnah. So we're back to where we started, that the human being, when they reach the age of moral accountability, they have to reflect, they have to seek, they have to know for themselves and build their foundation from there. So for us, we have to engage in the study of Aqeedah on the level of Fard Ain, of individually obligatory knowledge. We have to contemplate and come to knowledge on our own. But this opens up a lot of other questions that we want to address today. If we say that the individual Muslim cannot just parrot what their parents tell them, and they cannot just go along with what they hear in their Muslim village or society about Allah and His Messenger, rather they have to learn for themselves and remove from themselves the fetters of taqleed. What takes them out of the taqleed? And what does it mean to know? And what does it mean to reflect in order to arrive at that understanding? What does that look like? And how would a person know that they are contemplating and pondering and arriving at a sound knowledge? So let's address those questions. What takes one out of taqleed in matters of belief? It's very simple. Knowing the proof. knowing the proof. And when the ulama talk about this, they say that knowing the proof is to have an internal knowledge about that thing you believe in. Even if you cannot articulate it, even if you can't verbalize it, you can't put it into your own words, but you know it in your heart. And even if you can't respond to arguments or reply to anyone in their doubts, it doesn't matter. Even if it's contained inside of you and you don't have the ability to put words to it, knowing the proof inside of yourself is sufficient. What does that look like, though? There's a really good example that is cited by Al-Imam Al-Asma'i. Al-Imam Al-Asma'i was a scholar of the Arabic language, and he has a very famous saying that illustrates very well what it means to know in such a way that one is no longer making taqlid. He says that he asked a desert Bedouin, a nomad, Bima arafta rabbak, how have you come to know your Lord? Which is the question we're trying to ask. How do we come to know Allah? This Bedouin says to him, have you not seen, or have you not considered that camel tracks in the desert indicate the presence of a camel? And that the changes around you show you that there was one there. Therefore, when I observe the creation, the heavens and the earth, the stars, the cosmos, the world around me, and all the changes, these all indicate to me that there was one who brought them into existence. Because everything that has change has a beginning, and everything that has a beginning requires one to bring it into existence. So I'm observing creation. He's basically saying, I'm observing creation and I see change. And I know that all of these things require a maker. That's how I know. That in itself is sufficient. Just knowing that, he articulated it very well. But if a person knows that and they can't articulate it, it's still considered proof. So if a person knows even that level, they are not muqallid. They're not muqallid. They're not blindly following what someone else says. They know in themselves. You see, that Bedouin reflected. He looked around him and he came to this conclusion because of the intellect Allah gave him. That is what it means to contemplate and ponder, to arrive at the truth, to know the truth in a very simple way. Now, we're going to learn that in a much more formal way, in a much more detailed way, so that we have far more than even that Bedouin. But that simple formulation of the Bedouin shows us what it means to know and to contemplate, so that we are not blindly following anyone in matters of belief. So, coming to that, we said that the majority view of ulama concerning taqleed in matters of belief is that it is generally invalid. Generally invalid. And if a Muslim has the ability to contemplate and to seek, to do the nadar, and they do not, they are disobedient. They're committing a sin by being in that state, but they are still Muslim. They still have iman, provided the content of their faith, what they believe in, through taqleed, is sound in and of itself. So this is the general ruling of taqlid according to the majority. So pondering deeply and knowing the truth is your first duty at onset of youth. And a person might ask themselves, okay, well, I've passed my youth a long time ago. I'm now well into my adulthood. Did I have this nazar? Did I contemplate and arrive at knowledge of the truth? Generally you did. Generally you did. But that doesn't mean that every single detail of your beliefs was arrived at through nazar. Belief in the existence of Allah Ta'ala, most people, yes. Who are Muslim, yes. They have this. But all of the details, the things that we're required to know, not always. That's why when we study Aqeedah, covering books like these, we often get shocked. We often get very surprised as we go through them because we see areas of belief that we didn't know about, or we hear about beliefs that we have that are actually quite faulty and shaky and not on firm grounds. So there's still more to learn for us, especially in the environment we're in today, where we're not in a village, we're not surrounded by believers and masajid in a pristine environment. We're surrounded by all sorts of things, so we have to have more fortification. Yes?
Are we accountable for those things that we maybe acted upon or based on the shape of foundation?
Can you repeat your question?
Are we accountable for those things that we maybe did, maybe put something in prayer that we were doing incorrectly? Are we accountable up until the point that we
If a person learns what they need to know regarding the prayer, and through that knowledge they come to understand that their previous prayers were done in such a way that they will be considered invalid by all four legal schools, then technically they would have to redress that. They would need to make those prayers up. But that's a case-by-case basis. Accountability still remains for those things we're ignorant of. If they are mistakes and sins, then we make tawbah. But if they're things like prayer and fasting, then those things would require makeup. But that one would need to consult with a scholar to see, is that really the case? Because sometimes we learn fiqh of prayer, for instance, and we learn that this thing, XYZ, is invalid, and we say, oh my gosh, I've been doing that for so many years. All my prayers are invalid. The best thing in that case is to seek a mufti and explain the situation in detail. Because one wouldn't be required to make those prayers up if what they did was valid, at least according to one school, or in such a way that it's not considered invalid by all. So that's a detailed question. Khair, so I'm going to switch the board here. Hopefully this stands up.
Maybe slide it over just a little bit, just towards you, the center. No, the actual.
You want to do it?
I'm just thinking it's like on this. I don't want it
Okay, so after having discussed the issue of taqleed, of blind following in matters of belief, we come to a discussion on epistemology, which is a really big word, a nice $10 word, as we say. And we have to talk about this because, as we said in line 6, the first duty is to know. The first command, awwal wajib, it is to know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. He commands, know that there is no God worthy of worship but Allah. He gives us the command to acquire knowledge concerning this. Imam Ibn Ashir he says in his Murshid al-Mu'in about the basics of deen, أول واجب على من كلف ممكنا من نظر أن يعرف الله والرسول بالصفات مما عليه نصب الآيات. The first obligation upon those who are charged with moral responsibility and who are capable is to know Allah and His Messenger and their necessary attributes that are established through rational and revealed proofs. If we're going to fulfill the obligation of knowing, we have to know what it even means to know. How do we know what we know? That's the question we seek to answer when we talk about epistemology. Epistemology is a big word for saying how we know what we know. It's very, very important. It's critically important. And most people, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, don't really know what they know. Their epistemology is on very, very shaky grounds. So if the first obligation is to know, we have to ask, what is knowledge? How do we know what we know? And that is addressed in the area of epistemology. What is ilm? What does it mean to know? When we talk about knowledge, we give a broad definition of knowledge, and we give a definition of knowledge used in the science of theology. This is important. So ilm is defined as إدراك الشيء على ما هو عليه. In Arabic, إدراك الشيء على ما هو عليه. The key word here is idrak. Now, idrak is to ascertain, to grasp, to comprehend, to have access to something. It is to comprehend or grasp something as it really is. It's to reach something as it really is. To attain unto something as it really is. It's to have access to that thing. Right? And at this stage, usually teachers will ask a question. And I'll put the question out to you all. What's in my pocket? Who said keys? You said keys? Who else? Anything? Any other guess? Money? So in my overcoat pocket there is something. There's actually a couple of things. What's in my pocket? Now you said keys. But how do you know? She heard them rattle. Okay, you said money. How do you know? But I'm pointing to this pocket. So I'm pointing. How do you know it's in this pocket and not in the other pocket? You don't. Okay, so
based on like experience, like what people typically with the keys. People typically have money in their pocket.
But that's not knowledge, is it? That's a guess.
No, I know, but I'm just saying.
So knowledge is not to guess. Even if you guess correctly, it's still a guess. We're going to cover this in the next class. What masquerades as knowledge, but what is not really knowledge.
You're asking for sure what is
Yeah, for sure.
We're just like, we don't know.
So the answer is keys. You said you knew because you heard them. That hearing is a form of access. That's why we said knowledge is access to something as it truly is. Is it possible that you may have misheard? Yes. And we'll get to that later. But if you don't have access, then you're either guessing or you're imagining what it could be, or maybe someone says keys and you don't know yourself, you don't have access yourself, but you follow them and say, yes, I say keys too. That's taqleed. You don't have access. They might have access, but you don't have access. Now, what if they're wrong? Then you'll be wrong as well. So in order to escape that, you need to have access yourself, and that's ilm. So the general definition of ilm is idrak al-shay' ala ma huwa alayh, to ascertain or comprehend, grasp something, to have access to something as it truly is. That's the general definition. But when we talk about knowledge in the area of aqeedah, of belief, we give a different definition. And this definition is mentioned in the books of aqeedah that we learn from our teachers. And it's more precise for our purposes. And the definition of that is al-jazm al-mutabiq lil-waqi' an dalil in Arabic. And this translates as conviction that is congruent with the actual, or which matches reality based on evidence. There's different ways you can put that in English. To have certainty in something that matches the reality of that thing based on evidence. Conviction that is congruent with the actual, with reality, based on evidence. We see here that there are 3 layers, 3 parts to knowledge in the area of aqeedah. The first is jazm. Jazm in Arabic means conviction, certainty. This means you're certain, you're firm, you're not shaky, you're not wishy-washy, you're not subject to doubt. The second part of that definition is mutabiq. Mutabiq. Mutabiq means it's congruent, it matches reality. So the object of knowledge, my conviction about that thing matches the reality. It's congruent. It matches what it really is. And lastly, it's based on dalil. It's based on proof. It's not guesswork. I have a reason. I have an argument for my belief. There's justification for my belief. If any of these 3 are missing, we have a problem. If we're missing jazm, if we're uncertain about something, that's not knowledge. If we have certainty in something, but it doesn't match reality concerning that thing, it's not true knowledge. So we take the example of the keys. You said money. If you were very certain about this, that certainty alone doesn't mean you really know. A person can have all sorts of certainty and shout it from the rooftops. That on its own doesn't make their belief true. It's only true if what they are expressing with certainty matches the reality of the situation. So if you were extremely certain that it was money and not keys, and then I take out the keys, you now realize that your conviction didn't match the reality of the situation. It has to match. If you have conviction, and that conviction matches reality, in the case of the keys, should still be based on some proof. What was the proof in your case? It was the hearing. Your mode of access was through hearing. So it's not the strongest proof, but it's still a proof in the sense that it was your senses. One of the modes of knowledge, the ways of knowing, are the five senses. Right? We're going to talk about the different ways we know what we know. One of them is the senses, the sense organs of hearing and sight and so on. These are ways of knowing. How do you know that there's an apple pie in the oven? You smell it. Or you open the oven and you see it yourself. But maybe your nose is plugged, or maybe you don't smell it. Maybe it's out of the refrigerator, so there's no smell. And maybe you're blindfolded. How do you know there's an apple pie? If you touch it while being blindfolded, you know, okay, I can feel the crust, I can feel the apple inside. And then lastly, you taste it, and then the taste tells you exactly what it is. So these are ways of knowing, and there's more ways of knowing. But you have to have these three together for it to be correct. Now, in the area of Aqeedah, all three have to be there. If one of them is missing, it's not truly knowledge. So our belief in Allah Ta'ala has to be certain. It has to be firm. Can't be on shaky grounds. And our belief has to match reality. It cannot be believing things about Allah Ta'ala that are not true of Allah. If a person worships a statue, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, and calls that statue Allah, or worse, or equal, they pray and they imagine a physical form that they call Allah, are they really worshipping Allah? No, they're worshipping an idea, an image in their head. So the image in their head is not congruent with the actual, not mutabiq. So their conviction, though it's there, it's not congruent with reality. And if they don't know, then they're lacking the dalil. So it's if they are blind and deaf, you mean both blind and deaf at the same time? If they're deaf, they still can see, right? If they're blind, they can hear. Right? Hearing is the primary means of transmission. In the Quran, whenever Allah mentions hearing and seeing, hearing always precedes seeing. It actually takes priority over seeing. If a person doesn't hear, but they see, they can still observe and infer from their observation the handiwork of Allah's creation and arrive at that belief. If they don't hear or see, they're still their own intellectual faculty, their own awareness of their existence and their change, and that they need an originator. So the aql is there, the fitrah is still there, even if the senses are lacking. One doesn't have to have the physical senses to have belief in Allah Ta'ala, because ultimately it is the aql and the qalb, the heart and the rational mind, the fitrah of the human being, that is contemplating and arriving at these understandings. Yeah.
Can you, what does it really tell us? It's a very important thing. For all of us, to
Fitrah?
What is in fitrah?
Well, we're going to talk about that later. When we talk about the forms of proof, we're going to talk about that, inshallah. So what we're going to end on is one last question. We talked about taqleed in matters of law, taqleed in matters of belief, and the difference between the two types of taqleed. We said one of them is obligatory for the non-specialist, and that's taqleed in law. One of them is generally haram for the one who has the ability to observe and to arrive at knowledge. We talked about the definition of knowledge, the general definition, the specific definition in this field of aqeedah. This is about arriving at knowledge of haqq, of truth, which leads us to the very last question for today. Is there such a thing as absolute truth? Is there anything that we can say is absolutely true? Or do we say that truth is relative? It depends. Yes.
Well, if there's a tornado and it hits and destroys the whole city, you see it, heard it, and you realize what happened.
So that's is that the answer is yes? There is an absolute truth.
It's possible, yes.
Here's something interesting. Did you know that 3 out of 4 Americans say that there is no such thing as an absolute ultimate truth? 3 out of 4. 3 out of 4 believe that truth is relative. It's a matter of perspective. This is why they say, my truth, or you live your truth. You ever hear that? Truth is relative. It all depends. It's just a matter of perspective. That's your truth. That's your opinion. Truth is relative, right? So truth is treated like a fairy tale. Believe whatever you want. You do you. You live your truth as long as it's not hurting anyone. And just be tolerant and don't say that another person is absolutely wrong. Because we all have our truth. We all have our perspective. Is that true? Right.
This fancy word still
There is absolute truth.
there is absolute truth. It has to be absolute truth.
Plant a seed, water it, it'll come up. You did it
It's
yourself.
truth, it will shine, it will
Yes.
You want to know the easy argument against relativism, the idea that truth is relative? It's just a simple question. If someone says, because we have two sides here, those who believe that there is such a thing as an absolute truth, or absolute truths in the plural, and those who believe that there is no such thing as absolute truth. Truth is relative. Those people who believe that truth is relative, if they say there is no absolute truth, you ask them, that statement you just made, there is no absolute truth. Is that statement absolutely true? Or is it relative? If they say yes, it's the absolute truth, they have affirmed the very opposite of the claim. It's a contradiction. And if they say no, when I say there is no absolute truth, it's not an absolute statement. It means that yes, there is absolute truth. It's very self-defeating to say that there's no absolute truth. It will be like me getting up and writing on the board, there is no such thing as writing. All you have to do is say, is that writing? Yes or no. If I say no, well, what am I denying? I'm saying that this thing that is writing is not writing. It's absurd. It's absurd. But you'd be surprised. It's quite widespread in the modern world. Postmodernity is defined by not having any grand narrative and refusing to acknowledge that there is such a thing as an absolute truth. And people think that if you affirm an absolute truth, that somehow you're saying, if you don't believe what I believe to be the absolute truth, I'm going to call for you being burnt at the stake. Hearkening back to the Inquisition. Therefore, because it's either Inquisition or moral relativism, well, we don't want people to die, we'll just be moral relativist. No, but there is absolute truth. So, if we say that there's no absolute truth, how do we know anything? There's no way to know anything if we say that there's no such thing as absolute truth. If nothing is true, absolutely, not even that statement, how do we know anything? Last week there was an argument being put forward by certain so-called academics, postmodern academics, who were saying that 2 plus 2 can sometimes equal 5. And that it's not absolute that 2 plus 2 has to equal 4. Right? And this is, if there's no ground for any statement, such as 1 plus 1 equal 2, how do we know anything? Right? It just completely demolishes the foundations of thought, of arriving at any understanding. So there's that. And inshallah, when we get further along in the study of the epistemology, we'll probably spend 2 weeks on it. We're going to look at the issue of this relativism as well as skepticism. And I mean, the final reflection here is looking at how this applies to us in real life. The issue of taqleed, the issue of knowledge, the issue of absolute truth. What might this look like in a real life application? In a real life application, consider your child comes up to you one day and says, "Mom, Dad, why are we Muslim?" You might reply, "We are Muslim because the Quran tells us to be Muslim." And that child can reply, "But Billy at school is a Christian and they have the Bible. And his parents tell him he's a Christian because the Bible says so." The parent might reply, "That's true, but our book is true and their book is not true." And the child says, "Yes, but that's what they say as well about ours." And then the child doesn't have a satisfactory answer from the parents. And the child says, "It seems like we all have truth, or we have some of the truth. It seems like we're all the same at the end of the day, and no one's absolutely right or absolutely wrong." How do you reply? You can't reply with a circular argument. You can't say the Quran is true because the Quran says it is true. You have to have an understanding of your belief that is based on sound knowledge, so that you know what you're talking about. You know the content of your faith. And this is why we have to get out of taqdeed and have sound knowledge. And that's why we're here studying this, alhamdulillah. In the next couple of classes, perhaps 2, we're going to cover epistemology. We're going to look at what it means to know what we know, and look at 2 different kinds of judgments. And you can read the next few lines. I'll tell you for homework. Just read them. The section on the rational judgments. Number 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. These 3 we're going to cover next class, inshallah. And we'll cover a second type of judgment, and then we'll go straight into the text, covering the content of the aqidah, inshallah. Any other questions?
I like to.
Yes.
The last class, I was able to attend, we uploaded the video on YouTube, and the third and fourth semester wasn't running, it cut out early, the video, but we ended up.
Yeah, that's why I'm doing an audio recording today, because the video recording cut short somehow.
I was wondering if you could just briefly go over on 4 and 5, the fourth and fifth.
4 and 5. Okay. So looking at the poetry lines 4 and 5, yes, the video got cut off. So those who were attending live heard everything, and those who watched it on video missed, I think, the last 10 minutes. So going to those lines, you said 3, 4, and 5? 4 and 5. He is fairest of all, purest of speech, and with knowledge of God he came to teach. He is mercy to all, tender and kind. He's the closest of all to the divine. We spoke about the physical form of the Prophet ﷺ briefly, and we talked about his speech being the purest of speech, and that the ultimate objective of the Prophet ﷺ was to bring people knowledge of Allah Ta'ala, to teach them about Allah Ta'ala, and this is consistent with the message of all of the prophets and messengers. As Allah mentions in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. And we have sent to every nation a messenger proclaiming, worship Allah and avoid false gods. So he came with that knowledge of Allah Ta'ala. He's a mercy to all, tender and kind, the closest of all to the divine, which is fairly self-explanatory. This is a part of the introduction which mentions the name of Allah Ta'ala, praise of Allah, and salat and salam, salutations upon the Prophet ﷺ, with a brief description of some of his realities and his qualities and the overarching objective in him being sent to humanity. Yeah. Yes.
One of the things you did cover was that with all the previous prophets, when people rejected those previous prophets, they were destroyed. However, this is not the case with
True.
the Prophet ﷺ.
Concerning line 5, where it says he is a mercy to all, we said all here means everyone, including disbelievers, because he stated in the hadith that the previous nations, if they rejected their prophets, they will be met with swift punishment. But that punishment has been withheld, it's been delayed. For those who reject him, that is not something they experience in an overwhelming fashion, as was experienced in the previous nations. So those who reject him are not going to receive what the people of Lut or Ad or Thamud received. It's different. This is a kind of reprieve, a chance for them to embrace Islam, some time for them. And this is a part of his mercy and why he is rahmah lil alameen, for all of existence. No. طيب.
I have a request, not a question.
Sure.
Which is the subject of Aqidah, and it's very important. So, can you please also bring this with the youth? They are growing up here in anywhere in the world, doesn't matter this country, anywhere, we are all like Western now, the whole world. So this is a very important, it is very, very important. So can you also please try to do this with the youth, like youth group, you know?
Yeah, I insert Aqidah into virtually every discussion we have.
Time to time.
Yeah. I would aspire to teach them Aqidah like this, but, attention spans and all. I don't know if that's going to work. But I try to put it in every single lesson we have. Even if it's about something contemporary, I link it back to the foundations of belief. If you don't know who Allah Ta'ala is, well, yeah, why bother with this halal and haram stuff and prayer and all of these things? You have to know. Oh, why? Because kids ask, well, why is this haram? I have kids write down questions anonymously. And I look at them, 80% of the questions could all be answered if they know who their creator is. If you know who Allah is, the question, why is pork haram, isn't really that big of a deal. It's not that important. But it's a big deal if you don't know who your creator is. It seems very arbitrary. Why can't we have bacon? Why can't we have this? Why can't I date? Why can't I have premarital sex? What's the big deal? It's a big deal if you know who made it haram. But if you don't know who made it haram, then it seems arbitrary, especially when everyone else in society is calling you in that direction. So, 80% of the problems, I think, would be solved by them just knowing who their creator is and knowing there's accountability, right? And you can explain the reasonings and the social wisdoms behind the prohibition of different things, but those wisdoms will only impact the heart if they already have the foundation of belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If that's lacking, then it seems, well, I could think of wisdoms for why I should be able to sleep around. And it's all arbitrary, isn't it? Because it becomes a question of who determines what is moral and what is not. If I determine it based on my whims and desires, it's good. And if someone else says otherwise, then what makes them right and me wrong? Right? We're going to touch on that when we get to the issue of moral judgments and how do we determine what is right and wrong. Do we have the independent ability as human beings to arrive at that, or do we require revelation to determine that? It's a somewhat complex conversation on its own right, but we'll talk about it inshallah as we get through the book.
Question. One is ways of outside, just the class policy that you talked about, that lead following without knowing your creator. Okay, since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you pray to him, you worship him 5 days, 5 times a day, without knowing, without having. It's just hard to ask this question. Would we be accountable for that before studying this aqidah?
That's actually it's a deeper theological question, which is, if the person doesn't know that they have to know, are they accountable for not knowing? It's a deeper theological question, and there's some difference of opinion about that between Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari and Imam Abu al-Mansur al-Maturidi. There's some divergence there. But we know that all human beings will not be accountable until a messenger has been sent to them, and a messenger has been sent to us. So it's a question of whether the person is content in their ignorance or whether they have the drive to know. So in an ideal situation, everything around you in your society is reinforcing these beliefs. When you hear the adhan, when you attend Jumu'ah, when you go to the masjid, when you go to Eid, when you're with your parents, when you're with your relatives in society, there are these constant reminders, and there's an organic growth in coming into a deeper understanding about your beliefs. Nevertheless, even in a Muslim society that has all of these things, ignorance can still be rife, and a person can have a basic understanding but still have certain errors in belief. Which is why in most traditional societies where sacred knowledge was valued, they would make sure to teach people the foundations of belief. You would have, whether it's in the subcontinent, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in North Africa, you would have people teaching and learning basic elementary texts about belief in Allah Ta'ala. In Morocco, for instance, Algeria, Mauritania, North Africa in general, they tend to study a text called Al-Murshid al-Mu'in. All the kids would know it. All the kids would learn this. Yeah, Mauritania, West Africa. North Africa, West Africa. The standard textbook for knowing these things was Al-Murshid al-Mu'in. Al-Murshid al-Mu'in is a foundational text that covers what every Muslim has to know. He starts off talking about belief, and then he talks about fiqh, and then he talks about spirituality, the diseases of the heart, their cure, and the positive qualities to develop. So he covers all of the bases in that very basic text. Little children would memorize it and study it. But I tell you what, today, if someone has memorized that text and studied it, today, they're seen as a sheikh, as some kind of ustadh. Like, mashallah, he studied the Murshid al-Mu'in. Yeah, he studied a text that 8-year-olds memorize. It's like, would you brag about knowing green eggs and ham, or Sam I Am, or the Cat in the Hat, basic books that kids read? It's kind of the same, but on something more important, obviously. So in traditional societies, there's always a focus on studying those things, reviewing them. You would have masajid, in the larger masajid, you would have these gatherings where these kinds of books would be taught repeatedly. There's always that environment where the foundations are being emphasized time and time again. But with colonialism, with the the decay of our institutions of learning, with the drop in aspiration, people are content in ignorance. But that's usually the case in the larger cities. In the villages, it's often been a problem, even hundreds of years back. Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Yusi, one of the scholars of Morocco, he was talking about this in his commentary on an Aqidah text. He said that even in a place where the majority of people are Muslims with sound beliefs, depending on where you are, knowledge can still be rare. You can still be in a place where there's not that many scholars or people of knowledge, and ignorance can be rife, and even Muslims can have really strange ideas about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is why we're not saying that everyone has to be a theologian, a scholar of Aqidah, but there has to be a basic foundation. And the best way of teaching that is through texts like these, in any language in which they're authored, whether it's in Urdu or Arabic or whatever, just the basics of belief, so that a person has a solid foundation. Oh, yeah. They say what?
They say hi or hello to you.
Oh, that's just.
But they think salam means that when they come here, that's what salam means. It's hello.
Yeah, that's ignorance and inferiority complex.
Really? You say inferiority?
For some people, they don't want to give salams lest they get outed as a Muslim in public. So if you say Assalamu alaikum to them, they look around. Is there anyone noticing me? Are they going to hear me reply? And if there's too many people, they'll just hi, and they keep it moving.
I taught in a school in Toronto. The school that I taught in it's a public school, but it's 95% Muslim kids from India, Pakistan, mainly. Now we have Syrians or whatever, but 90% of the staff are not Muslim. And all the time the teachers would come up to me and say, oh, the children tell me that Assalamu alaikum means hello, how are you? And I'm like, no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It does not mean that, And I'd have to always explain stuff, and I'd have to always tell the teachers, that's culture, this is the religion, right? Like, because even, I'm in hijab, and even these kids coming from this country, they hear my Canadian accent, and they say to me, are you Muslim? Yes. That's what I'm saying. But even when we were in Morocco, we lived in Morocco for almost 1 year. I'm in a taxi. They would assume I'm Moroccan right away. And then they're like, are you Muslim? And I'm like, why would I be dressed like this? So you see that there's a huge cultural, they just don't get it.
I'm wondering if you're taught to say that to us.
I think it's just ignorance.
It's real ignorance.
One time many years ago when I was in Pakistan, I was traveling with some friends in Lahore, and we were at some intersection, some roundabout, and the police pulled us over for some traffic violation. So me and my other American friend, were sitting in the back, and police officer looks over us, these two white guys, and my friend goes, Assalamu alaikum. And the police officer looks at the driver and asks him, he speaks Urdu. So Assalamu alaikum is an Urdu phrase for hello, I guess. That's just, ignorance is rife. The default status of most people is severe jahl in matters of belief and in matters of law and in matters of things that are individually obligatory upon them.
And the other side thing, they don't try to think a little bit like common sense.
Right? And it's not a case of inability, because some of the same people who are very ignorant about the basics of their Islam apply their intellect to engineering, to medicine, to law, to Western law. They use their energy for these pursuits, but they can't dedicate even 20 minutes to study something basic that's key to their own salvation. This is the problem that we have. We don't value what is necessary for our own salvation. Khair, inshallah. We'll conclude here, and in the next class we will start with the epistemology in the poem. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi.